Item 9D, review report and provide direction regarding amendments to San Bruno Municipal Code.
Sorry about that. I'd already checked it off.
Just give us a moment, Mr. Mayor.
Thank you, Melissa.
All right, I think we're set to go. Thank you very much. Tonight is the first night of our introduction to the San Bruno Municipal Code, and I'm surprised that there's only a few members of the audience here and that not more people stayed to listen to our program to modify the entire San Bruno Municipal Code, all 11 chapters of it. So we're going to talk briefly about a couple of things tonight. So first of all, why are we doing this? Why should the code be updated? How are we going to update the code? And then we're going to take a few minutes to look at specifically Title I and Title II. Those are the first two titles of the code. Remember, there's 11 of them. So we're going to go through all of Title I tonight and a little bit of Title II because that has a topic of particular interest. And then we'll talk about next steps. So let's take just a second and talk about why the municipal code should be updated. And I think it's fairly clear that we need a 21st century code here in San Bruno. There's 11 titles plus the zoning code. The zoning code is Title 12, and that's going to be separately amended. You might have heard from staff and remember some of your study sessions about the updates to the zoning code. So the difference between the zoning code and the rest of the code is that the zoning code has to first go to the Planning Commission for review, and then it's recommended to the City Council. So the first 11 titles, actually all of them, were really adopted in the 1980s, so that's about 40 years ago. And we've noticed as we've gone through the code over the last number of years that frankly some of it's outdated, could be obsolete. There's case law that might have changed it, and some portions of it are internally inconsistent. And of course, the City Council also periodically adopts new ordinances. And those are brought into the code over time, but it's also important to look at those new ordinances and make sure they don't affect anything else in the code inadvertently. So that's what the code review is really for, is to give you a full 21st century code so that you can move into the future. So the question is, how are we going to update the municipal code? And the first thing we're going to do, and already have done in fact, is contact the code publishers. Most people don't know that the code is published by an outside entity. It's called Quality Code Publishing, and they will actually do an initial review, both an initial legal and policy review of all of the titles of the code. And so they have already done that for chapters 1 and 2 tonight that we're going to be talking about on an expedited basis. And they will do that for the rest of the code, and their process will be done in about 3 months. So before the end of the year, we'll have a detailed review from Quality Code Publishing about all of the things that might need to be cleaned up in the code. So once we have that, we're going to look it over, and we're going to review and recommend ordinance amendments, just as we're doing tonight, in sequence. So we're going to do Title I tonight, part of Title II. Next time we'll come back with the rest of Title II, we'll tackle Title III, and so on. The trick with that is that many of those titles involve the work of other departments, and so this is not just work of the City Attorney's Department, it's really a work across the entire organization. And frankly, that's the reason, one of the reasons why it's taken a long time to start out, because the organization is, I think we all know, is leanly staffed and does not have a lot of bandwidth in other departments to spend their time looking at the city's code. I can do that, Quality Code can do that, or outside counsel can do it if we need help. But ultimately, these are the codes that are implemented by your staff, and so they have to be able to spend a substantial amount of time working on it. And I'm already working on chapters 2 and 3 with the finance director and others so that we're looking ahead to those. So the plan is to evaluate all those proposed amendments with our staff and outside legal counsel if we need some help with that. And then we're going to use the standard 3-step process for your review, which is going to be, we'll show you what those amendments might look like, make some recommendations, have you discuss them and give us some direction. then at the next meeting or subsequent meeting, come back for an introduction of the ordinance, and then finally for adoption. So, are we ready? Title I, the good news is we're only going to go through the sections that are different. So we looked through Title I, and there are only 7 sections that have proposed changes in them, and those are reflected in the first attachment in your staff report. So let's just take a couple of minutes and go through those if you don't mind. So the first one's easy. We don't have a jail, so we're going to get rid of that reference. The rest of the amendments are really to be consistent with state law. So for example, 1.24.020 is an amendment to be consistent with state law about claims. State law now has the maximum misdemeanor fine at $1,000 instead of $500. And it also provides for new additional fines for some health and safety code violations. So we thought we would update those. We're recommending deleting a section that is a little bit archaic that authorizes citizens to issue citations. I don't think we really want citizens to be doing that. The city can't really control their activities, and that section, as far as I know, hasn't been used, at least not in the last 8 to 10 years, if at all. One of the sections of the code, 1.32.030, has an appeal time of things that aren't otherwise referred to in the code of 30 days. Well, mostly in the code it's 10 days to appeal. Like, for example, the appeal of a planning commission decision is 10 days. So we recommend reducing the 30 days to 10. Otherwise, you'll never know if your decisions are final until 30 days later, and you don't necessarily want to wait around for that. The other section on appeals that we made a modification in is to allow appeals to be heard at special meetings. Right now, your code says they have to be heard at a regular meeting, and that can really constrain your time and how you do that. So we'll have a little more flexibility. And then the last suggestion is something that I would say came out of experience, and that is what we have found with development in the city and in other places is that often Public Records Act requests precede development applications and also follow development approvals. And so the city is responding at its expense to public records requests that are really filed for pre-litigation reasons. And our code already requires, and our contracts with developers already require, that developers pay the costs of that litigation and reimburse the city for those costs. It doesn't cover the costs, sometimes substantial, of the city responding to Public Records Act requests. So what we're proposing is that the code be amended to add those PRA response costs so that developers who have an approved project, and now the city is getting a bunch of Public Records Act requests relating to that project, that the developer has to pay those costs if the city incurs costs in responding. And we had a substantial number of public records requests, for example, for the hotel project, and for other projects we expect, and the more development there is, the more of those we're likely to get. So that was a change that we're recommending. So that takes care of Title I. And so now moving to Title II. And there are about just 5 sections of this code that we're recommending changes in. And let's just go through those briefly. So the first several of them are really just amendments for consistency with state law regarding notices of special meetings, notices of closed sessions, and notices regarding elections. And if you don't mind, I want to pause for just a second on the notice regarding elections, because this is something that was somewhat bedeviling in past election seasons. So the code was written to specify a location for your city council meeting that no longer exists at a time that the meeting does not occur at, and within a week of the election, which is before the county gives us the results. So we really had to do gymnastics and backflips to try to figure out how are we going to get city council meetings scheduled and comply with the code, and the answer was we really couldn't. So we ended up finding some workarounds, and perhaps the city clerk will be pleased to know that we've come up with what I think is a workable definition in our code about when those meetings will occur. Under state law, the county has to say what the results of the election are, canvass them within 28 days if it's consolidated. And if it's not a consolidated election, they have to tell us or we have to have the results by the 4th Friday after the election. So that's what the code is proposed to be modified to now. It also allows that the canvass of results by the City Council, as well as the selection of officers for the following year, can be done at either a regular or a special meeting. That was a problem we ran into last year, as you might remember. So we tried to clean that up and make sure that it provided the most amount of flexibility while giving the certainty that's necessary when you have the announcement of election and officers. So that was really the main change that we made to that section. And then lastly, I want to focus on a section which involves the selection of the vice mayor. So right now, the selection of the vice mayor is done by a rotation process. And that process is that council members or vice mayor who have not served as mayor or vice mayor, or who otherwise served least recently. So it's sort of a reverse order. And the effect of that is that, for example, council members who are newly elected, such as Council Member Davis, congratulations, are by that rotation required to be the vice mayor for the following year. In most other cities that we've surveyed, the city council exercises its discretion each and every year to select the vice mayor. There are some alternatives, however, and we want to spend just a couple of minutes going over those, and then I'll turn it over to Councilmember Salazar, who has done some research as well. So one alternative is you could leave the system in place the way it is. The advantage of a set rotation system is that there is no discretion, so there's usually no debate every year about who the vice mayor is going to be, as opposed to most other cities who each year have sometimes a robust and healthy debate about who that individual will be. On the other hand, you could decide to do that. You could decide to make that decision annually, and that's consistent with what most other cities do. However, what you could also do is adopt a different rotation system. And so, for example, you could look at, instead of reverse city council tenure, you could flip it, for example, and have it be that the most experienced is at the top of a rotation, and then it goes down. So the result of that would be that the system would be a rotation, and there is one city we were able, actually Councilmember Salazar was able to find, the city of Oakley, that apparently does it that way, and I think you'll see at the dais, and we have available for the public, the city of Oakley's ordinance on their rotation system. And then Councilmember Salazar also has at the dais there for you, and we have for the public, a proposed ordinance for the city that is actually a little bit simpler to understand than the Oakley ordinance, frankly, and that would also work here. So before I turn it over to him to explain how that would work, I only want to mention one thing about timing, and that is that if you were to give direction to modify the ordinance in any way, that would normally come back to you at the next meeting for introduction, at the following meeting for adoption. However, the ordinance isn't effective for 30 days, and that would be after your first and only meeting in December when you appoint new officers for the following year. So you do have a couple of alternatives. One thing you could do is keep the current ordinance in place as it is for the 2019 rotation, and then just go ahead and adopt the new ordinance if you wanted to. So that would be effective after 2019 for 2020. Or you could schedule a special meeting to introduce your new ordinance if you wanted it to be effective right away, and you'd have to do that before the 17th of this month. So I'll turn it over to Councilmember Salazar, but just briefly, the next steps are to provide some direction about Title I and Title II. Do you like those changes that we proposed? Confirm for us, if you don't mind, the timing and schedule to complete the review of the remaining titles. We think it'll take about 24 months. It could be a little bit longer. It's hard to know. And then if you have any questions, I'm happy to answer them. And now I think Councilmember Salazar has a couple of comments.
Okay, so first of all, I apologize to my colleagues for the lateness of getting this particular document out, and I think the one we want to focus on is the single page with very tiny writing. The second two-page document with the larger writing is an actual copy of the City of Oakley's language. But In a nutshell, the proposed language that I was able to glean from the city of Oakley and a few other cities that I looked at would basically create a ranking system similar to what we have now, but it takes each member's tenure into account, ranks them based on their seniority, and it does account for a potential tie in that seniority by saying that their position on the ballot at the time of their election would determine who goes first. So it makes it very unpolitical. It takes away the any potential for, controversy that has occurred in other cities in selecting their vice mayor, and I believe it puts it in a more predictable and more fair fashion. In looking in the past couple of years, I know that Irene's been bumped twice, and so I think this would address it. And also in Mark's other point about, when it could be adopted. So if we adopted it for 2020 being the first year, I think Irene would still, in either scenario, be the next in line to do it. So she's been already bumped twice, so she would finally get her opportunity to do it. This really does guarantee that everybody gets a chance to do it within their tenure. So I think it's a little bit more fair and should... does anyone have any questions on how it would work? I'm hoping y'all had a chance to do a quick read. It's actually the last paragraph on that page that really gets to the meat of it. So I don't know if there's any questions or concerns on that.
No, I don't have a question. First of all, thank you for doing all the research and finding this very elegant and fair solution. The very first time I served as vice mayor, I was excited, but totally inexperienced, and barely could figure out what next steps during an agenda. So that was an interesting experience. I think this works best, and I appreciate that. I really appreciate a rotation. I've experienced from other council people the difficulties in choosing or not choosing and the personalities that come out, and everyone suffers. There's no good solution to that. So I think this is, as I said, an elegant solution.
Okay, thank you.
I think it made perfect sense the way it currently is said. No, I'm just joking. I remember saying to the mayor, "What? Don't ever be sick." So I definitely, Michael, I appreciate the comments. I guess maybe the only comment I have is if the rotation, I don't know if this would be, but a member not interested in taking the role of vice mayor due to personal issues or something like that they could skip that? Does that need to be said, or is it they could?
Yes, and I believe the Oakley ordinance has that type of provision in it.
That's good.
Marty, anything?
No, I absolutely agree. When you're first on council and you're vice mayor, you're like, oh, I turned it off. Sorry. So, yeah, I absolutely agree. Thank you. Thanks, Michael.
Sure. What you going to charge us?
Mark, was there anything else?
No, there's not. If there aren't any questions about the rest of the ordinances.
Okay, so let's just see from council if there's any additional questions since we've commented on the vice mayor. Michael?
So Mark, I was curious, do we have an option in our municipal code to be less specific rather than more specific? And what risks are there in that? So when I look at things where we say that we're going to do things on a specific day, or we identify that our meetings have to occur at a specific address, for a lot of cities, that they have their council chambers in City Hall, probably not a big deal, but we're up here at the Senior Center, hoping maybe one day in my lifetime I'll see a new council chambers built, but I'm not holding my breath. But if we need flexibility, is there really a need to be very specific in terms of addressing those things?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the
Mark?
answer is
Mark?
yes.
Before you answer, because I want to include something I was thinking is, we talked about what if we wanted to hold a council meeting somewhere else? And I brought that topic. I know you could say, well, you could have a special meeting. But let's say we wanted to go into a neighborhood. What if we wanted to go into different parts of the community? Really, that specifics, I think, precludes some of that. And so anyway, that was just thank you, Michael. Yes, go ahead, Mark.
So normally with respect to regular and special meetings, and we can have the clerk weigh in on this as well, state law does require that there be meeting times and places specified in the code. And the reason for that really is for the public to be certain about when and where those meetings are going to be located. So they know that they can go to a particular place and there's going to be a meeting there. As opposed to, you could imagine a city council, not this one of course, but others, who might choose every single week to hold a special meeting somewhere in a different location all throughout the city, and nobody could really ever keep track of where that might be. So it's sort of an absurd result, but that's actually the reason for the rule. So where we have flexibility, I understand what you're saying. We'll try to include it by saying you could either have a regular or a special meeting, and we've had, of course, special meetings at City Hall. But we'll look and see if there's any way to have that be more flexible. And I don't know if you have any more comments about that.
No, the city attorney is correct that state law does say that for regular meetings, our code does have to specify the dates of the second and fourth Tuesdays of every month, and the location that the meetings will be held at. So that's why this is very outdated, because it has a different place. And this would specify, for now, the senior center. And then, of course, when we get those chambers that you're dreaming about, we can update at that time to indicate that new location.
Okay.
And then just to quickly follow up, you can hold special meetings at other locations, and so that's the flexibility that you have to do that. It's just that you can't change your regular meetings around to have them be at some arbitrary number of locations.
Okay, thank you. And the other question I had was regarding the section around council member salaries. And it seems to indicate there that, based on changes in population, that our salaries will be adjusted. And it says that they shall be changed. And I know that we, as a council, have never implemented that. We've stayed stable. I don't have a problem with keeping our salaries where they are. But it does seem that when the language says that that's going to happen and then we don't do it, we're kind of violating our own policy there. So that might be an area where we might want to soften the language, saying that would be our opportunity to do it, but we're not actually required to. I'm not sure.
Right, you're not required to adjust those salaries as the cost of living goes up, and I believe this council has declined to do so.
Mm-hmm.
Over the years. You're not required to decline. You can decline if you want to by not acting on it, and that's what this council has generally done.
Okay. But do you agree that the section where it says that, that the Department of Finance placing the city in a population group, blah, 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 that it automatically triggers a change, and maybe is that required to be in there, and then we just overrule it, or how does that work?
Yeah, actually, the population group is, I checked this, is 35,000 to 50,000.
Okay, so
and so once it's within that band, it's the same. It's only when it would increase above that it would trigger that new rule.
Not likely. Okay.
Not in our lifetime.
Not in our lifetime. Okay. All right. Well, thank you.
Other questions from council? Comments? Marty?
On this item?
Yeah.
Oh, I'm good.
Okay.
No, we covered it. Good job.
Thank
Mark,
you. So
do you have enough? Or?
Yeah, no, that's plenty. Thank you very much. We'll bring this back for introduction at the next meeting with Councilmember Salazar's suggestion, and if there's a consensus with Councilmember Davis's suggestion that the proposed vice mayor can decline if he or she wants it, then it would move to the next person in the rotation.
Yes.
And is there any question about the timing of it, or shall we just bring it back regularly at the regular meeting and have it effective in 2020?
Yeah.
Are we okay just to keep it on path
Yeah.
to
Yes.
2020? Yes. 25.
Okay, very good. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Thank you.